Today's topic is preciousness, which I'm really interested in talking about with you today. It feels especially poignant to me in my life right now. So I'm hoping that you will consider how important this topic actually is, when it can sound a little frivolous or sort of an odd thing to even think about on any given day. So speaking of preciousness, I can't believe it's already August and the summer's almost over. So I think I want to feel very, very precious about each and every day of August and enjoying the beauty of summer and the long days and everything that summer brings us. So the quote today is from Maya Angelou, and she says, "In all the world, there is no heart for me like yours. In all the world, there is no love for you like mine." And I'm struck by the enormous beauty in those two simple sentences that only Maya Angelou can put together in quite the same way. So this notion that there's no heart for me like yours, that I love you so much because of who you are, whether you're my friend or my lover or my mother or father or sibling or neighbor that I have a special relationship with. And in all the world, there is no love for you like mine. And I think many of us have had that feeling of incredible heartbreak when we're ending a relationship and we have a feeling that no one else is going to love you the way that I've loved you, and no one else is going to love me the way that you have loved me. And so the power of love and the power of recognition of how excruciatingly important we are to each other begs us to consider how precious each and every one of us are. And I think when people are, depressed or anxious or living in addiction, they really tend to discount the degree of preciousness of their human life. And we're able to see preciousness in other things. We see it in babies. The example in the meditation today is that we see it in gemstones because we ascribe meaning to these stones. I mean, I've always thought it was wildly odd that diamonds were so precious and so expensive, because we're ascribing meaning to a rock, essentially, a piece of seeming glass. I know it's not glass. I know it's forged and formed from the earth, and that makes it unique and beautiful and unusual. But because something is those things, unique or unusual or difficult to get, the more difficult something is to get, the more we tend to ascribe great value to it and consider that it's precious because it's rare. And so think about that the value of the stone depends on how rare it is, how unique it is, and also the form of it and the context of it. But do you ever consider how rare you actually are? That you are unique and one of a kind, and there's no other one made like you. Like, you are the only one of its kind in the world. And so to consider that is a pretty mind-blowing consideration, I think, because when there's only one of one thing, we will run to a museum to see it. We will run to a store to try to be the first one in line to get it. But we don't consider the uniqueness and the power of our own presence and our own preciousness. So I want to remind you that as I'm talking, if you have any comments or thoughts or questions, to please type them into the chat box. And if you want to ask a question anonymously, you can write to us at Center for Healthy Sex, and that URL will come up shortly here. Also, if you're interested in talking to any of our intake counselors about any issues about sex, love, or relationship, you can call us at 310-843-9902. So if you think about your birth and how many valuable gifts you were given at birth, starting with how precious your life is and that you are going to set out on this really impossible experience called life, and also I would say impossible experiment to call life, but you were given this perfect form, the seed, the germination, the acorn that turns into the oak tree. So if you were setting sail In other words, you have this perfect vessel, and it's equipped with everything you could possibly need to make this journey. Wouldn't you consider how amazing you are, that you got to have this spiritual experience in this particular body, and that this is a work of art, this physical body, that everything about it is extraordinary, whether it works the way that other bodies work or not. The fact that you are here and that you have all of these systems is quite extraordinary. So I want you to consider the nuances of what it means to be in a body, especially if you have the good fortune to be in a healthy body, an able body, that you can have experiences in life that are really limitless. I don't think we could possibly have all the experiences there are on this planet, but we can certainly have a lot of them if we have the willingness to strike out and to stop judging what we did or didn't get or do and don't have, and we start to take stock of what we really, really do have. So again, you couldn't have a more perfect body. And I think, in the world we live in today, we're always comparing our bodies, if they're good enough or thin enough or tall enough or capable enough, to all the images that we get in the popular culture. But if you were to close all that noise out, if you were to not consider the comparison game, and you were really to be present with the gratitude of what you have. Again, if you're fortunate to have an able body, that you have 10 fingers and toes and 2 feet and 2 working legs and, a working pleasure system in your genitals and your digestion and every other part all the way up to your sight and sound. To consider that will have you starting to love yourself and thinking about yourself as a gift in this context. And so can you also think about that you are a living story of your past and your present, and that you have a way of sculpting your future once you really understand the living story of your past. And so what I mean by that is that nobody's going to experience the world as you have, and nobody is going to perceive the world as you do. And one of the challenges I think we have on the planet today is that we have all these different perceptions of what reality is. So it's increasingly difficult to agree on what reality is, whether, something is violent or not violent, or someone's crazy or not crazy, or if something is worthwhile or not worthwhile, or if we value something over something else, because we have so many different perceptions. But consider that your perception is your reality. And so how do you check out your reality? How do you check out to make sure that your perceptions are accurate for the most part, in general, in consensus with the rest of humanity? So certainly practicing nonviolence is a reality check. And that is a value that I hold greatly. And I believe that we could live in a nonviolent world if we were all experiencing empathy and compassion and chose to have the safe and the same perception across the board, and found other more intelligent ways of managing our differences. So if no one else sees the world as you do, that you alone synthesize experiences and your own stories from your vantage point, that is a unique narrative and something that you have to offer someone else. And I think one of the things that human beings long for is this desire to share our unique experiences and narrative with somebody who wants to hear them, somebody who's interested in you, somebody who is curious about your lived experience and finds that appealing and even arousing. And that's what we're looking for when we're looking for a mate, in part. So there's something else I keep wanting to say about this, but I'm not quite getting to my point. I feel myself, just as I'm talking about this right now, sort of struggling to get to the kernel of what I'm talking about. And I think now that I said that, I think it's this, that no matter how horribly you might have been abused as a child, whether you were neglected or abused physically, emotionally, or sexually, and even if you were born with some disability and not in an able body, we have to consider, in order to make sense of this whole thing called life, that within that is a narrative, within that is a context and a story that needs to be told, that should be valued as a unique experience. And one of the things I think is happening in our culture today with the vast amount of violence and hatred is a lack of curiosity about the other, a lack of interest in really understanding where the other is coming from, as opposed to this narrow, rigid, violent-minded perception that if you're not like me, then I must hate you. If you're not like me, I must eradicate you. If you're not like me, you're not precious. Your heart, your soul, your sense of humanity doesn't matter. It doesn't exist because you are not identical to me. That is such an incredibly small-minded and collapsed way of considering life on this earth. I mean, that's why people kill, bugs, or they kill animals, creatures on the plains or undersea, because we get so afraid of being attacked, or we have to dominate in some ways, that instead of being curious about how the other operates and how we can coexist with that other, we instead choose to eradicate. So my invitation to all of you that are curious about this topic is to get interested in yourself first and foremost. Who are you? How have you come to be? What do you know about your ancestors? What do you really know about your parents? What they were struggling with, who they were, how they were abused, what they did to each other, what it was like that they even got pregnant and decided to have a child, and how they raised you and how equipped or ill-equipped they were, and also the culture that you were living in at that time. All of these things make up who we are. It's our narrative, and it's what makes us unique and precious. And that's not talking about being narcissistically unique, like full of myself because I'm so special and I'm so different than everybody else. That is not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about a deep honoring of your ancestors, your grandparents, and the people before them, and the ways in which we are fighting to evolve as a species right now. That our parents were probably abused in some ways or another, and they probably abused us, but hopefully not to the extent that they were abused. And we are stopping the buck whenever we sit on a therapeutic couch or a 12-step meeting, or really start to dig into our psyches and look at our patterns and why we do what we do. And so this is a call to evolution, this notion of preciousness. So Paul says, I wonder whether that animosity to the other may stem from an I'm not enough, one down fear base. And I would say yes. I would say because of population explosion, we are in a race for resources right now. There is resource competition on the planet. And the superior being, in many cases, the white supremacist, the white people, are fighting to preserve their stake in the ground, especially in our country today. And so if you have brown skin or black skin, you're going to be eradicated because we want what we want for ourselves. And that's sort of the mentality that's taking place right now. As opposed to recognizing that if you can get what you need, then I can get what I need too, that we're in this together. We can actually help each other and be constructive and think about and troubleshoot how we're going to deal with the resource competition, as opposed to let's just kill off a bunch of people that are other because I'm terrified I won't be able to eat or live in my nice cushy house, or have more money than one person could possibly need, instead of sharing the wealth and supporting each other across the board, really being decent human beings. So fear is definitely the major factor that's creating this kind of violence and unrest on the planet today. So if you can start to see that your life is filled with worries and concerns and struggles, just like every other human being on this planet. Nobody escapes without their trials and tribulations. No one gets out of this thing alive or without suffering, as I've said before. And so just know that you're like every other person on the planet who bleeds when they're cut, whose heart is broken when their child is killed, who's in excruciating pain when somebody does something violent to them or their families, that we are all identical. And I would say all mammals in large part are identical when it comes to these affective feeling states. You kill an animal's child and it hurts, it's in pain, it wails. So we can't get out of this interconnectedness, but this recognition that everything changes. The only thing that has you holding on to this immutable nature of yourself is this recognition that you're precious, that you are resilient, that you can endure and withstand just about anything. I mean, human beings are incredibly adaptive to their environments and what's going on, and we have great capacity for resilience also, that we are fighters, and we can endure all sorts of things in order to prevail. And that is a form of preciousness. So if you can take your abuse and you can turn it into your greatest strength, that is the invitation of evolution, I believe. Not to wallow in being a victim, not to wallow in feeling sorry for yourself, and then using that as an excuse to act out, whether it's with drugs, alcohol, sex, gambling, food, workaholism, you name it, but to get out of being a victim and to really stand strong because you're recognizing these capacities in yourself. And we all have them. They may be laying dormant at this time. You may not feel up to it at this time, but you have the gear, if you will. You have the hardware to do what you need to do to pull yourself up out of whatever pain you might be in. And Stephen says has a quote from Carl Jung here, that the greatest burden a child bears is the unlived life of its parents. And that is really a stunningly beautiful statement also. There's so much in that one sentence. But the greatest burden a child bears is the unlived life of its parents. Stephen goes on to say, I have learned that my father had no sense of love from his father, so he vowed to never let me feel unloved, but it created a rather enmeshed relationship, sure. I'm right in the middle of using this experience as a way to discover my preciousness. Do you have any thoughts on this? Well, that sort of brings me to tears, because you see in this story that your father overcompensated for what he didn't get, because he thought doing the right thing would give you more of what he didn't get. And that, of course, creates a different problem. It creates that enmeshment where the child feels responsible for the parent's feelings. And so the best advice I have for you is to have great compassion and empathy for your father, trying to do the best he could do, but in so doing, he created these adaptive strategies in you that are distorted. And so if you can start to unpack those distortions, part of it's going to be setting boundaries with him and saying no to him. I can't do that for you, or I can't be that for you. And being able to tolerate his upset or his disappointment, or him feeling like you're not grateful because look at all he did for you and now you're pushing him away. Because you have to be able to differentiate. You have to be able to be your own man, separate and apart from him. And so what he gave you was, I think, probably a lot of sensitivity and open-heartedness, but he also probably stole from you your ability to assert yourself and stand on your own 2 feet. And that's going to be hard for you. It's going to be difficult, but it's going to pay off in the end when you do it. And you'll start to realize that he gave you a gift, because you're going to have to work against your tendency in order to be stronger. And you might not have gotten that gift in that way. You would have gotten it in a different way. So I hope that answers your question. Someone writes, is it futile to ignore old trauma from childhood? Will it always pop up regardless? And I would just say yes. What I mean is it important to use and honor our past even if it's ugly? is that still preciousness? It is tough for me to know whether it's healthy and constructive to drudge up past events and memories if I can't know beforehand whether it will help me. Well, the answer is it will help you. I mean, there are reams and reams of neuroscience that show us that when we are, hurt in any way, shape, or form, it changes the way our brain and our nervous system functions. It changes the way we regulate ourselves. It impacts our organs, our heart, our ability to rest and digest. Everything is impacted. So we know going in that it's going to be painful because we couldn't feel the pain that was commensurate with the abuse at the time we were children because it was too overwhelming. And if you've got a parent who is the offender, you can't feel how difficult that feels because you can't even go to them for the soothing. They can't help you out. So one of the beautiful things about psychotherapy is that you have a fair witness. You have a therapist who can walk down that road with you and soothe you and regulate while you're feeling today what you could not feel yesterday. And that creates neural integration. That creates a sense of wholeness. And so you're no longer depressed or anxious or not quite able to function in your life or not able to make things happen that intellectually you think should be happening with ease. And so it will always pay off for you to go back and bring that child from the past into the present moment. And I know in my bones it will help people. Otherwise, I wouldn't say that. I mean, there are no guarantees. But if you're doing this work appropriately, you will see great benefit from it. And so to just ignore old traumas from childhood, it will never go away. It will always show up because you're always going to have these distorted patterns. You'll always wonder why you can't get ahead in life, or why you can't get your footing, or why you can't be in a love relationship, or why things never work out. Those things, it will always come back around. Someone writes, I'm a sex addict and would like to know if any therapist can help with my addiction. There are no registered sex addict counselors in my area. Well, I would suggest that you call our intake line 310-843-9902 and talk to an intake counselor because we have lots and lots of resources. So we can help you find somebody in your area or talk to you about online programs or intensive programs that will help you get your recovery started. So someone says, when do we know when it isn't our responsibility to step into our parents' fights, especially when I'm the only crying shoulder they have? Well, I would say that if you are adult enough to ask that question, it's now. Being triangulated into your parents is a form of emasculation. It's a form of enmeshment. And it's a form of being married to your parents, that you'll never be able to have your own relationship if they're constantly triangulating you into the relationship. And what you're doing is you're acting as a buffer so they don't have to deal with each other. And so it is time for you to say to both of them, do not call me, do not talk to me about your marriage. It's highly inappropriate because it makes you parentified with both of them, and it doesn't allow you to have your own life. So I would say you need to put a stop to that immediately. And if you need help with somebody or somebody helping you set boundaries and holding those boundaries, a licensed therapist is the way to go for that. Stephanie writes, you said we all may have dormant resilience. So how do we awaken or access that? Well, resilience is a funny thing to talk about it. But the way that you start to find out what your resilience is that you first have to deal with your trauma. And that means if you're carrying resentments, if you're walking around as a victim in any way, if you feel like you're in a one-down position or your self-esteem is not good, it's difficult to find that resilient part of yourself if you're still bogged down by these other problems. So until you deconstruct the problems through a therapeutic process, until you really, really get to know yourself, you can't know how resilient you are. And this I have found is really a lifelong exploration. that when we learn, who we are by way of knowing who our parents were. For example, I know very clearly now more than ever, who both of my parents were, what their stories were, what kind of trauma they suffered, what their relationship was like. That tells me why I ended up being the way that I am. And it also has given me clues along the way about what I need to work on. Because if I don't know, if I can look at my mother, for example, and say she was always this way, and see that I am also that way, and understand that she was that way because of what happened to her, then I have to look at myself and say, gosh, I'm carrying these intergenerational patterns that are unnecessary for me now. I don't need to do that. My mother did it because it was a protective mechanism, because she was, in a emotionally abusive relationship with my father. And so she transmitted that to me, but I'm not in an emotionally abusive relationship with my father or my husband, so I don't need to be defensive in that way. So I have to work now to drop a defense that's been a lifelong pattern. And when I drop that, then I can see how much more resilient I am. I feel freer in my heart, in my body. I'm more capable across the board. So all of this transfers back, not just psychologically, but neurophysiologically, on how we're wired and how we respond to things. Someone says, I find the daily reading in Mirror of Intimacy very helpful in my road to recovery. Do you have any advice for me in regards to sex addiction? Well, since I don't know what your specific problem is in sex addiction, it's hard for me to answer that question. In general, I would say that you should absolutely be in a 12-step program where you have sponsorship and you have other fellows in recovery, because that's what keeps people sober over time. Having a good sex addiction therapist is crucial to doing the work of staying sober and understanding why you became a sex addict to begin with. Doing the deeper trauma work I'm talking about, so you can become more resilient and really start to love yourself and your preciousness. And finally, if you can get into a group therapy for sex addiction, I would highly recommend that you do that also. And then someone asks, how do you hold on to self-value in a committed relationship? Well, that should be your first and foremost priority in a relationship, because if you don't value yourself, how can you possibly value the person you're in relationship with? If you start to give your value away, then I would say you're in an unhealthy relationship. So people talk about getting in relationship and, quote, losing themselves. That is not a healthy relationship. So getting into a relationship should be additive. You should have a strong sense of self. You should love yourself. Your home should reflect that you care about yourself. You should have friends and family members around you and community, so that you have a life that's full and vital and rich. And then when you meet a partner, they're additive to that. They're not coming along to pull you away from those people. The minute that starts to happen, that should be a red flag to you that that is not a good partner. That person is insecure. That person is struggling with their own self-esteem, and they want you to prop them up, in other words, so that they feel healthier because you're propping them up. So make sure that you are holding on to yourself first and foremost in those relationships, not letting somebody drain that away from you. So one of the ways to start to easily recognize our own preciousness is to start to notice the preciousness in life around you. And what better time than summer, when, the hummingbirds are really big in Southern California right now. I think because of all of the rain, we had all these flowers blooming in the spring, and they're super chubby. And so looking at how precious they are, or the flowers in your yard, or the kitten or the dog you see on the street, or the baby or the elderly person who's about to make their transition out of life, has you realizing the absolute preciousness and beauty of this lifetime. Certainly we see it in flowers because we see, a rose bud and how nascent and beautiful that is. And then the rose in its full bloom and how gorgeous it smells. And then we see the dying bud on the vine, and how beautiful that is too. But how its life is over. So you can see how fleeting life is, really, if you just watch the lifespan of a flower in your yard. So be in deep gratitude and amazement for these simple things, these simple moments of life all around you. Someone writes, what happens if you were too young to remember trauma? My parents lost a baby when I was 3, and my mom left my dad and took me to my grandparents for 6 weeks. Then my dad came to reclaim us. I was a rescuer, the glue in my parents' relationship. Been in therapy 4 years now and made great progress, just out of a dysfunctional, abusive relationship with a probable narcissist. So my preciousness has taken a knock. Any advice? Well, first of all, Susan, thank you for that beautiful account of your life and the courage to really be able to name it, but also to look at it and to say, wow, this was not my fault. This was the hand that you were dealt. You were born into this life. Your Achilles heel was that you were going to be a rescuer from the minute you were born. And so those deep developmental pre-verbal traumas really require very specific kind of therapists. They require therapists that work with the body much more so than talking therapy. So you may at some point down the road need a somatic therapist, someone who's trained in sensory motor psychotherapy or somatic experiencing. But these are the more subtle pre-verbal traumas that you want a therapist that's going to help you with to create that resilience internally. And then to notice your tendency to rescue men. I'm assuming it was a male that you were in relationship with, but it could have been a female. But let's say any prospective partners, that you should make a dating plan for yourself. And even any kind of rescuing behavior should be a no for you. So the minute you go to caretake, the minute you go to complete someone's sentence, the minute you go to lend money, to fix someone. So none of these guys should be fixer-uppers. You should have a clear list of what you want in a relationship with somebody. And you should not deviate from that. That means you're going to have to say no to a lot of people until there's a resounding yes. So I would recommend that you make a list of green light, yellow light, and red lights for you. And when you see those yellow lights or red lights, it's got to be a no. And you're probably going to have to date a lot of guys until you've got green lights ahead of you, because you deserve that. And by saying no, you're starting to take care of yourself, and you're starting to set your compass in the direction of not choosing abusive men anymore. But as soon as you make exceptions, then you're going to get yourself back into the abusive relationship, and you will do it until you are sick of doing it again. So hopefully this last relationship was a bottom for you and you're not doing that anymore. But sometimes it takes us a few iterations of this before we get the message, and that's just human nature. So good luck to you, and make sure that you are really paying attention to what's best for you. Stephen says, your books are wonderful, thank you. What's on your bedside table? Do you have an insightful book to recommend? Well, right now what's on my bedside table is a book by Alan Shore called Right Brain Psychotherapy, which is not a self-help book. It's a book on the neurobiology or developmental neuroscience and psychotherapy, and it can be a challenging read. So I don't know that's what you're looking for, but it sounds like you're looking for something along the lines for these topics. And one of the first, there's a beautiful new book out called The Untethered Soul that's a bestseller right now. So you might want to take a look at that to see if that resonates for you. But some of my favorite books along the lines of healing what we're talking about are actually John Bradshaw's books. And John passed away probably maybe 4 or 5 years ago now. And he wrote some really timely books, or books that hold up over time, that I would turn your attention to. One is called On the Family, and the other one is called Healing the Shame That Binds You. And those two books are really, they hit it out of the ballpark when it comes to looking at family dynamics and family dysfunction. And if you grew up with a narcissistic parent, Alice Miller's book, The Drama of the Gifted Child, is also a classic book. Someone says, why are women so vulnerable to relationships that don't serve them? Well, I think in part, there are two parts to that. I think part of it is social construction, that we are socially constructed to tend to the masculine. And this goes back to the beginning of time. And some of it is also the way we're socialized in our families. And that depends on what culture you come from and what the expectations are of females in households. But also, I think genetically, we are predisposed to serve. We are nurturers. We give birth. And that is biologically encoded into the organism. And so our tendency is to caretake too, whether it's, a seedling we've planted in our garden, a baby kitten or puppy that we've gotten, our own partners, elderly people in our families, our children, you name it. It's what we do. And so it makes us very vulnerable because our tendency is to give and give and give some more. And we have to pay attention to when we're not receiving, because giving can be a controlling proposition also. That if I'm always giving and caretaking, then I can say, look, see how much I'm doing for you. And also, that can be a way that I create my self-esteem. So it's very important to receive if you're a giver, very, very important. And also to look at how burned out you are from giving too much, because that's how we burn out, is from giving too much, not from receiving. All right, so when you dismiss your preciousness, you are devaluing yourself. And when you devalue yourself, that is a sort of a shame. It's sort of a crime against humanity. So don't do that. If you're struggling with self-compassion, take a look at the Mindfulness Self-Compassion book by Kristin Neff. This book is a really beautiful workbook that will have you working on self-compassion, which I think is infinitely more important than working on self-esteem, because self-esteem can lead to narcissism and grandiosity, because I'm just walking around talking about how great I am all the time. But self-compassion is about forgiving myself for the things that I don't know because I was enmeshed by my father, or because I was triangulated into my parents' relationship, or because my mother was angry and I didn't know why. So whatever happened to you, you can forgive yourself first, so you can forgive the people who were doing the best they can, but they did indeed hurt you. So be careful about not devaluing yourself or any experience you've had. Even if you've done something that was awful, where you've hurt other people, on the way, you didn't know what you know now, so you have to forgive yourself. And so when we can treat ourselves with compassion, when we value ourselves, that's how we'll treat other people. We won't be mean to other people. We won't judge them. We won't treat them poorly. We won't be rigid with them. We will start to treat them the way we treat ourselves. And also, when you are looking at the preciousness in life around you, think about how considerate you are to your lover or your children or your friends. And make sure you're treating yourself in the same way. And if you are inconsiderate or mean to them, then you want to take a look at why that is so. So practice inviting and affirming your preciousness every single day. That there are, people that say that we are perfect, whole, and complete just as we are. Pia Mellody is famous for saying that we're perfectly imperfect. So give yourself a break, let yourself off the hook, be grateful for who you are. Don't be anybody else. I mean, I think Oscar Wilde said, be yourself because everyone else is taken. So be grateful for who you are. And you can start by one of the healthy sex addicts in today's entry on preciousness is listing everything you feel precious about yourself. And to notice your thoughts and feelings when you're writing this list, and to notice what's in the way of you affirming your preciousness. Do you feel shame? Do you feel like that's a lie or it's not really good enough? I mean, look at the judgments that come up around your list of precious qualities. And also notice that feeling of pride that comes up. And can you tolerate the feeling of pride? Like, yeah, I am smart, or I do a good job, or I am trying the best I can in my marriage or my job. And yeah, maybe I'm not getting it perfect. And I want to look at that thing that I keep repeating, like what are the themes in my marriage, in my job, in my relationship with my parents? Is there a theme there that I can start to work on instead of getting defensive to say, oh yeah, I do that. Eek, that's not a very appealing quality I have. Where did I learn that from? Oh, I learned that, from my family of origin. And why did my family do that? Oh, it was a survival mechanism. Well, we don't have to survive anymore. I'm not living in that family anymore. It's kind of a not so appealing trait that I have. So I think I want to work on that. I want to notice every time I do that. When I say work on that. So for example, I have a tendency to interrupt people because, oh, I don't want to justify it, but I'll just tell you that I do. And it's not a good trait at all. And so I have to track back and look at where that came from, why I do it, what's going on. I can tell you at its base, it's anxiety driven. Because most of those type of behaviors are. So when I talk about working on it, what I talk about is that I am going to make a practice all week long of noticing the tendency to want to say something before somebody's finished with their thought. What I'm about to say may still be right, but it also may be wrong. And so if I can manage my anxiety and that desire to quickly give an answer and to stop myself, then I can start to change that pattern and not be such a bulldozer in conversation with people. And that is something I truly want to change, because it's an adaptive strategy of survival in a family where everybody talks really fast and everybody's got a lot of verbal intelligence and everybody's just talking all the time, that I don't need to do anymore. So I hope that's a helpful example of what I'm talking about, that this doesn't require, a massive 10-year psychotherapy excursion. If you've got a lot of trauma, that certainly is a requirement. But if it's a thing, a pattern that you're engaging in, that people have given you feedback about that you don't like, you can just look at it all week long and say, oh, there it is. Isn't that interesting? Wow, I do that. Look at how hard it is to restrain myself from doing that. And the more you're vigilant about it, the more I'm vigilant about it, the more I know that I can stop that particular pattern. So any other thoughts or questions about this topic before I start to sign off here? I've appreciated all of your questions. I think these are really good questions that you have. And that it has you thinking about, how can I heal myself? How can I change? What can I do so that I can start to make changes around me? Because I am convinced 100% that when we change ourselves, our relationships to everybody around us change, even though they may remain annoying, not likable, or whatever you think they are. The people in your family and your friends will start to shift because you have better boundaries, because you don't caretake to them, because you say no, because you stop interrupting them, because whatever it is you're doing, you are shifting your boundaries, and that will change your love relationships. So I want you today to attune to the preciousness of every moment, especially when you eat your lunch. If you haven't had lunch already, taste the preciousness of the food, be in gratitude that you have food, and cherish your life. Your very life. Anything could happen, especially on the heels of the atrocious news we had to endure all weekend long. And your body and your consciousness, and share your heart with the people that you meet today and all week long. So on that note, thank you for your precious listening today. And I hope you spread this way of thinking and being with all those that you meet. And as always, if you have questions, feel free to write to us at centerforhealthysex.com is our website, 310-843-9902 if you have questions about books or resources for therapy or any of those things. And you can always go online to Amazon and find Mirror of Intimacy there if you want to share that as a gift to your friends and family. So I hope you have a precious August and that you really appreciate the rest of the summer and have fun. And I look forward to talking to you in September. Thank you.